Every time I read the words of our gospel passage from Mark, I'm astounded because I can't recall at any other point in the scriptures where Jesus comes across as so human, as so conflicted, so painful, so vulnerable. He says, I am deeply grieved, even to death, to his closest friends. And then he throws himself on the ground and prays to God that if possible, that this hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. But not what I want, but what you want. 3 times Jesus prays these words. He struggles. He really struggles with his mission. He's never been so vulnerable. And I wonder what causes him such deep distress and agitation. What leads him to be so vulnerable? Is it because he knows that in these critical hours, that every one of his friends and followers will abandon him? Jesus knows that it's not only Judas that's going to betray him. Peter, who has just said to him that even if everyone else deserts you, Jesus, I will not, deserts him, along with all the other disciples. Peter, who has said that even if he has to die with Jesus, that he would not deny him, denies him 3 times later that night. His closest friends, they can't even stay awake. They can't even stay awake in his hour of greatest need. Peter, James, and John, who Jesus took with him into the Garden of Gethsemane, they keep on falling asleep on the job, right? 3 times Jesus returns from praying to find that they've fallen asleep. Could you not keep awake 1 hour? You can hear the disappointment in his voice. It must have been so disheartening for Jesus. These disciples, the closest of his friends, who have been with him for the better part of 3 years, who have been witness to things such that the world had never seen, right? Amazing miracles. In his hour of need, they were falling asleep. They were found to be seriously wanting. Ever felt all alone? How vulnerable is that? Ever felt all alone? Ever felt that there were times, for whatever reason, that your closest friends, your family, they've all sort of abandoned you. You're on your own, left you all alone. Do you know what it's like when your friends won't support you? When your colleagues and co-workers leave you stranded on your own? Have you ever stuck your neck out only to find that there's nobody sticking theirs out with you? If you have, you know what it's like. A little bit of what Jesus must have felt like that night in the garden. Maybe he was so vulnerable because he felt so alone. Or maybe his vulnerability was rooted in a sense of fear. Because, as divine as Jesus was, he was also fully human. And this was all new to him as well. Maybe it was about doubt. That for the first time in his life, the first time in his ministry, he felt a twinge of doubt. If it's possible, remove this cup from me. If I don't have to do it this way, then maybe let's do something different. Is it possible that it doesn't have to end like this? Is it possible that there might be a different way? Maybe his sense of vulnerability finds its origin in temptation. Unlike that time after his baptism when he was tempted after being in the wilderness for 40 days and nights, maybe this time he felt just a bit uncertain. The door was slightly ajar. Is there another way? Is there another way? When have you felt most vulnerable? When have you felt most vulnerable? When you've been lonely? When you've been isolated or felt unsupported? Have you felt most vulnerable when you've been uncertain, unsure of something, perhaps even unsure of your faith? Maybe something's happened and it's shaken the foundations of your faith and you don't know whether you believe anymore. Is that when you felt most vulnerable? Have you been most vulnerable when you've been afraid? Afraid of what might happen to your job? Afraid of what might happen to your family? Afraid of what might happen in your future? Do you feel more vulnerable as you get older? As your body begins to exhibit signs of mortality? How do we not feel vulnerable when we can't live independently on our own anymore? When our minds just won't recall or retain information like it used to? When even the simplest acts require the most courage and strength that we can muster? All of these things can leave us feeling so vulnerable. But I suggest that nothing leaves us more vulnerable than being in love, right? Nothing leaves us more vulnerable than being in love. Remember that first time that you met someone for whom you felt this overwhelming attraction? Remember how your stomach got all tied up in knots as you approached that first significant encounter? And if you've experienced this, you know that there's nothing quite as vulnerable, that we are never quite as exposed when we risk our hearts for the sake of another. True love is to risk everything. I remember watching this video some years ago. It was probably on YouTube. A man has gone to extreme lengths to prepare a wedding proposal, a surprise wedding proposal for his girlfriend. It's in the middle of a basketball game, and with the help of the officials, his girlfriend has chosen to participate in a halftime activity. So she's blindfolded, and then she's kind of spun around, and she's supposed to go, people will say, hotter, hotter, colder, colder, and she's supposed to go and find the mascot, blindfolded. And she gets a prize, right? So she catches the mascot, takes her blindfold off, and then the mascot takes his helmet off, and it's her boyfriend. She's confused. He takes the mic, and he gets down on his knees and asks her to marry him. And her response is priceless, right? She buries her face in her hands and shakes her head, and she runs out of the court as fast as she can, and right out of the stadium. And you can see, because this was shown on the evening news, you could see her boyfriend's face as his girlfriend bolts for the exit. It's a slow motion close-up of an imploding heart. It's amazing how lonely you can feel in front of thousands of people. Or that loneliness can be intensely private. If you've ever been left standing alone after being blindsided, after someone tells you something you never expected to hear. Love leaves us vulnerable like nothing else. Love leaves us vulnerable like nothing else. Why was Jesus so vulnerable in the Garden of Gethsemane that night? Yes, he was tired physically, emotionally. He was abandoned. He was tempted. He was even afraid. But what made Jesus truly, truly vulnerable that night in that garden was because of his great love for humanity, for his disciples, for you and for me. C.S. Lewis wrote, "To love is to become vulnerable, to risk suffering. If you want to make sure that your heart is not broken, you must give your heart to no one, to nothing. Then it will not be broken. Indeed, it will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable." Jesus gave his heart to us, to the people that he came to redeem and save. All that he went through, the suffering, the abandonment, the distress, the agitation, the fear, the temptation, everything that left him so vulnerable was rooted in his great love for us. I mean, why choose love? Why choose love? Why not choose power? Why not choose force? Why not choose might? When confronted with the clubs and swords of the priests, scribes, and elders, why not just call on the army of angels, the host of heaven? Why would Jesus let himself be arrested, humiliated, tortured, crucified? The answer is because he loves us. Because he loves us. Because he loves what was created to be good, what was created in God's image. Jesus knew that the answer to power isn't more power. The answer to violence is never more violence. You don't overcome force with greater force. The problem of death is never solved by having more death. Jesus knows that love is stronger than fear. stronger than death. And that perfect love casts out all fear. Jesus knows that the answer to the problem of human sin and all that comes with it, including death, isn't power, it isn't might, it isn't money. The answer is love. The answer is love. Jesus refused to fight power with power, evil with evil. When the authorities arrived with their clubs and swords to arrest him, and Peter cuts off the ear of the servant of the priest, Jesus says to him, "Put your sword back. If you live by the sword, you will die by the sword." He refuses to answer violence with violence. Are we as vulnerable? Are we as vulnerable? Do we dare risk our hearts for the sake of love, the love of God and the love of neighbor, or would we rather protect our hearts? Would we rather make them unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable? On Palm Sunday, God invites us to recommit ourselves to love. To recommit ourselves to love, to the vulnerability that love presents. How are you living your life? How are you living your life? Is your life connected to your ambition for power, for wealth, for prosperity, for security? Is it rooted in your desire to protect yourself, to make sure that you don't get hurt? Is your life about running from the fear of failure, working so hard, being so busy that no one can accuse you of being a failure? Is there room in your life, is there room in your heart for love? Not some throwaway phrase, but real love, risky love, vulnerable love. The most decisive decisions in our lives are always based in love, right? Think about that. We marry because we love. We have families because we love. We care for one another deeply because we love. And the most decisive decision in history is rooted in love, the love of God for us. We will be found wanting in our faith, and we'll fall asleep on the job. We will. We'll say one thing, but when push comes to shove, we'll abandon Jesus and we'll deny him. We will. But the good news of Gethsemane is that God is faithful. God is faithful. Jesus is vulnerable, but he's also faithful, and he moves with determination toward our salvation. God, who is love, was willing to risk great suffering, willing to risk betrayal and denial and desertion, willing to risk mocking and misunderstanding. There has been no pain greater than what God's love can bear. But God does not regret the price of love. Such vulnerability is what perfect love is all about. If we've received this wonderful, vulnerable love of God for us in Jesus, how is it that we could not be vulnerable to the needs of others, to the love that we need to show for others? Because that's what our world, I think, needs most right now, isn't it? Our world needs most right now an infusion of vulnerable love. In these times when fear of vulnerability runs rampant, the people of God, followers of Jesus, need to be about God's vulnerable love. As we come to the end of Lent, as we approach Easter, can I ask you, what has changed for you? What has changed for you? Is there any difference in our faith, or do we just live day by day, the same thing over and over again? Is anything changing for us? They say that everyone dies, but only some truly live. Only some truly love. If we've never known what it is to be truly vulnerable, it might be that we've never known what it is to truly love. Isn't it time to change that? Isn't it time to change that? Are there people and places in our lives that would be radically changed by an infusion of our vulnerable love? And more than that, perhaps we might be changed. We might be changed if we risked to love that way. There are endless possibilities, endless possibilities. We just have to find the conviction to begin. Just one person, just one cause. We just have to find the conviction to start. These are days of fear-mongering and wall building. These are days of circling our wagons in protectionism. We hear about it all over the place, don't we? It's all in the news. These are the days when fear of terrorism, of cyber espionage, of fake news threaten to convince us that the only way that we can be safe is if we exclude, if we shut out, if we shut down the other. Protect ourselves. Strength, not vulnerability, is the order of the day. And it shows even in our community, eh? When people become convinced that extending housing to the poor is not okay if it's going to be in our backyard. Too much risk. Too much risk. We don't want to be vulnerable. It's unsafe. We don't know what might happen if those homeless people move into our neighborhood. They're not like the rest of us. Put them somewhere else. Put them somewhere where we won't be vulnerable. If that speaks to you, if you think that's a cause that I need to be vulnerable about, there's a petition in our hall that supports the affordable and supportive housing here in Richmond. And I'm inviting you to sign it. I'm inviting you to sign it and say, I'm going to risk for the sake of the needs of others. Imagine if Jesus chose to act out of fear. If he chose only to protect himself, his own interests. Imagine if Jesus rejected vulnerability. But he didn't. He didn't. He knew true love, the love of his Father. And in that love, he found the heart to do not as he willed, but as God willed. Jesus did not protect his heart so that it would not be broken. He gave his heart to us, and we broke it. But the good news is this. The good news is this, that love is stronger than fear, that life springs forth from death. Wait till you see those seeds next week. The seed that falls into the ground and dies produces much fruit. The stone is rolled away from the tomb. And a life that death can never conquer or control emerges from that tomb to reshape and renew and redefine hope for all eternity. Friends, this Palm Sunday, will you allow yourself and will you allow your heart to be vulnerable? Will you let someone, something, some cause break your heart? Because you love so much? Because you will risk it for love's sake? If we say we know the love of our Father, if we know the amazing, vulnerable love of God in our lives, I pray that we too would find the heart to do not as we will, but as God wills for us. And to God be all the glory, now and forevermore. Amen.